Admiral Taman stood on the bridge of his giant spaceship watching the stars explode in the distance. Each bright flash meant another ship full of his friends was gone forever. The enemy ships were black as midnight and they moved like hungry wolves through space, eating everything in their path. The war had been going on for 3 terrible years now. Every single battle ended the same way, with his people running away or dying. The enemy called themselves the Void Swarm, and they were winning everything. They took planets like children picking flowers from a garden, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. Taman looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. They were all different types of aliens, but they all had the same look in their eyes. Fear and sadness mixed together like a bitter drink that no one wanted to taste. His communications officer was a tall blue creature with 4 arms who normally never stopped talking, but today she was silent. His weapons officer was a rock-like being who could usually crush metal with his bare hands, but now his shoulders sagged like he was carrying the weight of dead worlds. The Galactic Coalition had 30 different alien races all working together to fight the Void Swarm. They had the smartest scientists and the bravest warriors and the most advanced technology in the galaxy. But none of it mattered because the enemy was stronger and smarter, and they never seemed to get tired of fighting. Salmor. Luminari were a race of beautiful glowing people who lived on crystal worlds that sparkled like diamonds. They had been the first to welcome everyone into the coalition with open arms and kind words. Their homeworld was gone, now turned into a dead rock by Void Swarm weapons. The survivors lived on refugee ships with nowhere to go and no way to rebuild their shining cities. The Dreknari were the greatest warriors anyone had ever seen. They were 8 feet tall with scales like armor and claws that could cut through steel. They fought with honor and courage that made other races write songs about their battles. But even they were losing now. Their last battle group was down to just 12 ships when they used to have fleets of thousands covering the sky like storm clouds. The Cerebral Collective were the smartest beings in the galaxy, with brains so big they had to use machines just to hold them up. They could solve any problem and think their way out of any trap. They spent their time in great libraries floating in space where they collected all the knowledge of every race they met. Now even they were packing up their books and running away to hide in the dark corners of the galaxy, where maybe the Void Swarm would not find them. Taman had been fighting this war since the very first day when the black ships appeared out of nowhere and started destroying everything they could find. He had seen brave soldiers die and beautiful worlds burn and whole civilizations disappear like they had never existed at all. Every night he dreamed about the faces of people he could not save, and every morning he woke up knowing that more would die before the day was over. The enemy was not like anything they had fought before. Most wars happened because people wanted the same planets or the same resources, or they had old arguments that got out of control. But the Void Swarm did not want anything except to destroy and consume and move on to the next target. They did not try to negotiate or make deals or even explain what they wanted. They just came and killed and took everything and left nothing behind but empty space. Taman got reports every day about new battles being lost and new worlds falling to the enemy. The numbers were always the same. Coalition forces would fight as hard as they could, but the Void Swarm would win anyway. Their ships were faster and stronger, and they had weapons that could cut through the best Coalition shields like they were made of paper. Even worse, they seemed to have endless numbers of ships and soldiers while the Coalition was running out of both. The bridge was quiet except for the soft humming of the ship's engines and the occasional beep from the computers. Everyone was thinking the same thing, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. The war was lost and they all knew it. Maybe they could keep running for a few more months or even a year, but eventually the Void Swarm would catch up with them and then it would all be over. That was when the message came in on the emergency channel. It was encrypted with codes that Taman had not seen in decades. The message was short and simple, and it changed everything even though he did not know it yet. The message was from a place called Earth. It was a small blue planet on the very edge of Coalition space where a race called humans lived. Most people had forgotten about humans because they kept to themselves and never asked for help with anything. They had been invited to join the Coalition years ago, but they said no thank you and went back to doing whatever it was they did on their little world. The message said that the humans wanted to meet with Coalition military leaders right away. They said they had ideas about how to fight the Void Swarm, and they wanted to help with the war effort. Most of the other admirals and generals laughed when they heard about it. What could one primitive species do when 30 advanced civilizations were failing? But Taemin remembered the old reports about humans that he had read when he was young. They were strange compared to other races because they had never asked the Coalition for protection or advanced technology or help with their problems. When other species discovered how to travel faster than light by spending centuries developing careful scientific methods, the humans had just strapped themselves to nuclear bombs and shot themselves into space anyway. When Coalition diplomats offered to share advanced weapons and shields and computers with them, the humans had politely said, "No thanks, we will build our own." And they did build their own weapons even though they were crude and ugly compared to what everyone else was using. But somehow their crude, ugly weapons worked just as well as the fancy ones. Taemin made a decision that would change the galaxy forever, even though he had no way of knowing it at the time. He sent a message back to Earth saying that he would meet with their representatives. Then he ordered his ship to jump to the Sol system where the humans lived. As the stars stretched into lines of light around his ship, Taemin wondered what kind of people these humans really were. Soon, he would find out that they were the most dangerous species in the galaxy, and that they had spent thousands of years learning how to be better at war than anyone else. Captain Hyunwoo stepped off the small transport ship and onto the deck of Admiral Taemin's flagship. Behind him came 5 other humans, all wearing simple gray uniforms that looked plain and boring compared to the colorful robes and shining armor that other species wore. The humans carried basic equipment that seemed crude and old-fashioned, but everything they had showed signs of heavy use and constant repair. The other Coalition representatives stared at the humans with curiosity, and some with barely hidden disgust. These humans were shorter than the mighty Draknari and not as graceful as the beautiful Luminari. Their skin was different shades of brown and their hair was black and their eyes were dark. They did not glow like some species or have impressive claws or tentacles or other obvious weapons. They looked ordinary and weak and completely out of place among the advanced beings of the galaxy. But there was something in the way the humans carried themselves that made even the bravest Draknari warriors feel uncomfortable. They moved like predators who were always watching for threats and always ready to fight. Their eyes never stopped moving as they looked around the ship, studying everything they saw and filing it away for later use. When they spoke, their voices were calm and quiet, but there was something underneath that sounded like distant thunder. The War Council meeting was held in the flagship's main conference room, which was big enough to hold representatives from all 30 Coalition species. The room was filled with the strangest collection of beings in the galaxy. Some breathed air, and others breathed methane. Some needed bright light and others preferred darkness. Some communicated with sounds and others with colors or smells or direct mind contact. General Su-jin was the leader of the human delegation, and she was a small woman with graying hair and scars on her hands from old fights. She sat quietly at the table while the Coalition leaders talked about their problems with the Void Swarm. She listened without saying anything and took notes on a simple paper notebook while everyone else used advanced computer systems. Admiral, Taemin explained the situation to the humans even though they probably already knew most of it from their own intelligence gathering. The Void Swarm had better technology and more ships, and they seemed to be immune to every tactic that the Coalition had tried. The enemy won every battle even when the odds were against them because their ships were faster and their weapons were stronger. And their soldiers never seemed to feel fear or doubt or mercy. The Draknari General Roktar stood up and slammed his clawed fist on the table, making a sound like thunder. He talked about how his people had tried direct assault tactics using massive fleets in formation flying straight at the enemy. The battles were glorious and his warriors died with honor, but they still lost every time because the Void Swarm ships just shot them down before they could get close enough to fight properly. The Luminari ambassador Silora spoke next in her musical voice that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Her people had tried defensive tactics using their advanced shield technology to protect important planets and installations. They built huge space fortresses and surrounded them with mines and automated weapons. But the Void Swarm just brought bigger guns and eventually broke through every defense no matter how strong it seemed. The cerebral collective representative thought of victory communicated through a translation device that turned his complex mental patterns into words that others could understand. His people had tried using their superior intelligence to outthink the enemy. They developed elaborate battle plans with multiple backup strategies and contingency options for every possible situation. But somehow, the Void Swarm always knew what they were going to do and had countermeasures ready. When all the coalition leaders had finished describing their failures, the room fell silent. Everyone looked at the humans, waiting to see what these primitive people could possibly suggest that 30 advanced civilizations had not already tried. Some of the representatives were barely hiding their impatience and annoyance at having their time wasted by these newcomers. Captain Hyun-woo looked around the table, making eye contact with each representative before he spoke. His voice was calm and steady, but there was something cold about it that made everyone pay attention. He said that the coalition had been fighting the wrong kind of war from the very beginning. They were trying to beat the Void Swarm by being more advanced and more honorable and more civilized than their enemies. But the humans had studied the reports and the battle records, and they thought there was a different approach that might work better. Instead of trying to defeat the Void Swarm through superior technology and noble tactics, the coalition should make the war so expensive and painful and miserable that even the enemy would decide it was not worth continuing. General Soo-jin stood up and walked to the big display screen at the front of the room. She started showing pictures and charts that illustrated the human strategy. Instead of protecting civilian populations and important infrastructure, they would use both as weapons against the occupying forces. Instead of fighting honorable ship-to-ship battles in open space, they would use guerrilla tactics and ambushes and hit-and-run attacks. The human plan was to turn every conquered planet into a nightmare for the Void Swarm. They would teach civilian populations how to fight back using improvised weapons and terrorist tactics. They would booby-trap buildings and poison water supplies, and make life so dangerous and unpredictable that the enemy would need huge numbers of soldiers just to hold territory they had already won. Most of the coalition representatives were shocked and horrified by what they were hearing. This was not how civilized species conducted warfare. The luminary delegates said that using civilians as weapons was barbaric and against every law of war that had been agreed upon by peaceful species. The Draknari general said that there was no honor in attacking enemies who could not fight back properly. But Admiral Tae-min saw something different when he looked at the humans. He saw the cold, practical eyes of a species that had survived by being more vicious and more ruthless than anything that tried to kill them. When other races had evolved beyond conflict and learned to solve their problems through negotiation and compromise, the humans had refined warfare into an art form. The vote was close, but desperation won in the end. The coalition was losing the war so badly that they were willing to try anything, even if it meant abandoning everything they believed about civilized behavior. They gave the humans emergency military authority over 3 border sectors that were already mostly lost to the Void Swarm. It was a trial run to see if human methods could actually work. If they succeeded, the program would be expanded to other areas. If they failed, the coalition would surrender and hope that the Void Swarm would be merciful to the survivors. As the meeting ended and the representatives prepared to leave, Captain Hyun-woo made one final statement that would be remembered for generations. He said that the humans did not enjoy war or take pleasure in violence, but they were very good at both. They had spent thousands of years fighting each other, and they had learned lessons that other species would rather not know. The galaxy was about to discover what humanity really was underneath their quiet, polite exterior. Colonel Do-hyun stood in the ruins of what used to be the beautiful crystal city of Veltar Prime. 6 weeks ago, this had been a thriving luminary colony. Now it was a killing ground designed by human military engineers. Every street was a trap, every building a potential fortress, every civilian shelter a hidden weapons cache. The Void Swarm had taken the planet easily, as expected, but holding it was proving impossible. The humans had taught the desperate colonists new rules of war. Children learned to plant explosives. Elderly civilians became spotters and saboteurs. The peaceful luminari, who had never raised weapons against another living being, were now conducting nighttime raids that left Void Swarm patrol units scattered across the landscape. Meanwhile, in space, Commander Jin-ai was implementing the most controversial part of the human strategy. Her fleet didn't engage the enemy directly. That was suicide. Instead, they appeared without warning, struck at supply lines and communication arrays, then vanished before the superior void swarm forces could respond. They mined asteroid fields, deployed self-replicating weapon drones, and turned space itself into a hostile environment. The humans had brought something new to galactic warfare: the concept of total war. Every resource was a weapon, every citizen was a soldier, and every defeat was just preparation for the next attack. They taught coalition forces that victory wasn't about winning battles. It was about making your enemy suffer until they decided the cost was too high. The Void Swarm began, taking longer to consolidate their conquered territories. Their casualty rates increased dramatically. For the first time since the war began, their advance slowed. The galaxy watched in fascination and horror as humanity showed them what their species had learned during thousands of years of fighting each other. Major So-Young crouched in the command bunker buried deep under the surface of New Kepler, watching the tactical displays with grim satisfaction painted across her scarred face. The screens showed 3 massive Void Swarm capital ships breaking apart in the darkness of space above the planet. They had not been destroyed by enemy fleets or superior weapons, but by the world itself. The humans had spent 6 months turning New Kepler into something that had never existed before in galactic history. It was not just a planet with defenses built on it, but an entire world that had become a weapon. Every mountain contained missile batteries that could reach into orbit. Every ocean hid submarine launch platforms that could fire torpedoes at ships trying to land. Every city was connected by underground tunnels filled with enough explosives to crack the planet's crust. When the Void Swarm fleet arrived expecting another easy conquest, they found themselves fighting not just the people who lived on New Kepler, but the planet itself. The moment their ships entered orbit, automated systems that the humans had installed began targeting them with weapons that fired from positions the enemy could not see or predict. The swarm commanders tried to land troops to capture the surface installations, but the humans had prepared for that too. Landing zones that looked safe from orbit were actually kill boxes surrounded by hidden gun positions and minefields. The few enemy soldiers who survived the initial ambushes found themselves trapped in cities where every building was a fortress, and every street led to another trap. Across the galaxy, the human way of war was spreading like a virus, infecting every coalition military force with new ideas about how to fight and win and survive. Species that had conducted warfare according to ancient codes of honor for thousands of years were learning the brutal efficiency of human tactics and finding that victory mattered more than glory. The mighty Draknari warriors discovered that ambushing enemy patrols from hidden positions was more effective than charging straight at them with weapons raised high and battle cries echoing across the battlefield. It was not as glorious as their traditional combat methods, but it killed more enemies and kept more Draknari alive to fight again tomorrow. The intellectual cerebral collective found that psychological warfare could break enemy morale faster than any complex strategic plan they had ever developed. By spreading fear and confusion among Void Swarm forces, they could win battles before the first shot was fired and make enemies defeat themselves through paranoia and mistrust. General Kyung-ho had become the supreme human commander of all coalition forces, and he had established training centers on dozens of worlds where alien soldiers learned the arts of war that humanity had perfected over millennia of constant conflict. The aliens studied Earth history and read about the endless cycle of wars that had forged humans into the perfect military species. They learned about something called guerrilla warfare, where small groups of fighters could defeat much larger armies. By refusing to fight fair and using the enemy's size and strength against them, they studied urban combat techniques that turned cities into mazes of death, where every corner might hide an ambush, and every building could become a sniper's nest. The coalition soldiers learned about asymmetric tactics where you did not try to match your enemy's strengths but instead attack their weaknesses in ways they could not defend against. They discovered the human concept of total war where there were no innocent bystanders, and no safe places and no rules except winning at any cost. But most importantly, they learned the human art of never giving up no matter how bad the situation looked. Other species calculated odds and made rational decisions about when to retreat and when to surrender. Humans simply fought harder when things got worse and found ways to turn defeat into victory through sheer stubborn determination. Void Swarm was experiencing something they had never encountered in all their years of galactic conquest. They were facing an enemy that became more dangerous every time it was beaten. Every lost battle taught the Coalition something new about how to fight more effectively. Every conquered world became a source of constant harassment and sabotage that made holding territory more expensive than winning it. Captain Yunwu commanded a small flotilla of human-designed ships that specialized in what military experts called deep strike operations. His vessels were not built for stand-up fights against superior enemy fleets, but for appearing suddenly in the heart of Void Swarm territory and causing as much damage as possible before disappearing again. His current target was a massive enemy supply depot that had been considered impossible to attack because it was surrounded by defensive positions and patrol fleets. But the humans had taught the Coalition that impossible was just another word for something that required more creativity and planning than usual. Instead of attacking the depot directly, Yunwu's ships struck at the civilian infrastructure that supported it. They contaminated the water recycling systems that kept the station's population alive. They introduced computer viruses into the power grid that caused random blackouts and equipment failures. They used psychological warfare broadcasts to spread panic and confusion among the workers who kept the facility running. Within a week, the mighty fortress was falling apart from the inside as essential services failed and the population began evacuating in panic. The Void Swarm military commanders found themselves trying to run a strategic depot with no power and no water and no workers willing to stay at their posts. This pattern was being repeated throughout Void Swarm territory as human-trained Coalition forces brought their new understanding of warfare to bear on an enemy that was not prepared for such tactics. The orderly expansion that had served the Swarm for centuries was breaking down into chaos as they tried to deal with attacks that came from unexpected directions using methods that violated every rule of civilized warfare. Commander Hae Jin was leading a special operations team that had infiltrated a major Void Swarm communication hub deep in enemy territory. Instead of trying to destroy the facility, they were doing something much more insidious. They were feeding false information into the enemy command network, causing confusion and mistrust among Swarm commanders who could no longer be sure which orders were real and which were enemy deceptions. The psychological impact was devastating. Void Swarm forces that had operated with perfect coordination for centuries began making mistakes and attacking their own units and failing to respond to real threats because they could not tell truth from deception in their own communication systems. But the humans paid a price for teaching the galaxy their methods of warfare. Other Coalition species began to fear them almost as much as they feared the Void Swarm. The peaceful races that had formed the original alliance started to wonder if they had traded one destroyer for another. Admiral Hyun-woo, who had started this transformation as a simple ship captain, carried the weight of his species' reputation on his shoulders. The humans were winning the war against the Void Swarm, but they were losing something else in the process. They were becoming the thing that other species had nightmares about. The galaxy was learning that sometimes survival required becoming monsters, and that victory came at a price that could not be calculated in ships or lives or territory, but in the very soul of civilization itself. The humans knew this better than anyone, because they had paid that price many times before during their long, bloody history. For the first time since the war began, the Void Swarm was retreating, not because they had achieved their objectives, but because they could no longer maintain their positions. The hunters had become the hunted, and the galaxy's most feared conquerors were learning what it felt like to be afraid. Admiral Minho stood on the observation deck of the massive human dreadnought called Retribution, watching as the largest fleet in galactic history prepared for the final offensive against the Void Swarm. The ship was not beautiful like the elegant vessels that other species built, but it was deadly efficient in the way that only human engineering could achieve. Every line and surface was designed for one purpose, which was to destroy enemies as quickly and completely as possible. The humans had spent 2 years learning everything they could about their enemy. They studied captured Void Swarm technology, and interrogated prisoners and analyzed battle recordings until they understood exactly how the Swarm thought, and fought, and organized their forces. Now it was time to take all that knowledge and use it to end the war once and for all. The Coalition fleet that surrounded the Retribution would have been impossible to imagine when the war began. luminary stealth ships that could appear anywhere, in enemy space without being detected, flew alongside Draknari assault vessels that had abandoned their traditional honor codes for the more practical human concept of winning at any cost. Cerebral collective intelligence ships used their vast mental networks for espionage and sabotage, instead of peaceful scientific research. But the most dangerous ships in the fleet were the ones that humans had built, using lessons learned from centuries of fighting each other on Earth. They were not the fastest or the most heavily armored or the most technologically advanced, but they had something that no other species understood until it was too late. They had been designed by people who knew that war was not about honor or glory but about making the other side stop fighting through any means necessary. The offensive began with simultaneous strikes across 17 major Void Swarm strongholds scattered throughout their territory. These were not the clean surgical attacks that the Coalition had attempted in the early days of the war, but something much more comprehensive and ruthless. The humans had brought their own brand of warfare to the galaxy, and it was unlike anything that had been seen before. Colonel Yunji led the assault on the swarm's primary staging area, which was a massive space station that military experts had considered absolutely impregnable. The fortress was protected by layers of defensive shields and automated weapon systems and patrol fleets that could destroy any attacking force before it got close enough to do damage. Instead of trying to break through those defenses, Yunji's forces did something that shocked even veteran human commanders. They completely ignored the military installations and focused all their attention on the civilian infrastructure that supported the station. They targeted the water purification plants and the food processing centers and the waste recycling systems that kept hundreds of thousands of workers alive. Within hours, the mighty fortress was experiencing critical shortages of basic necessities, while its weapons and shields remained completely functional. Workers began evacuating in panic as essential services failed and living conditions became unbearable. The station's commanders found themselves trying to run a military installation with no support staff and no way to maintain the complex systems that kept everything working. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical damage. The Void Swarm had built their entire military doctrine around the idea that they were invincible conquerors who could take anything they wanted through superior force. Now they were learning that their enemies could make them suffer without ever engaging their military forces directly. Major Dongmin was conducting operations deep inside Void Swarm territory, using techniques that had been developed during Earth's most brutal conflicts. His teams infiltrated enemy installations not to destroy them, but to make them turn against each other. They planted evidence of sabotage and treason that caused swarm commanders to suspect their own officers of disloyalty. The paranoia spread through enemy ranks like a plague as military units began attacking each other based on false information planted by human intelligence operatives. Void Swarm forces that had operated with perfect unity for centuries began fragmenting into rival factions that trusted no one and suspected everyone of being enemy agents. Commander Na Rai led a fleet of small, fast ships that specialized in what humans called terror tactics. They did not try to defeat enemy fleets in battle, but instead made it impossible for the swarm to feel safe anywhere in their own territory. Her ships would appear without warning, destroy isolated outposts and supply convoys, and then vanish before enemy reinforcements could arrive. The psychological effect was more important than the material damage they caused. Void Swarm forces began expecting attacks from every shadow and jumping at every sensor contact. Their efficiency dropped dramatically as they wasted resources on false alarms and defensive measures against threats that might not even exist. But the humans' greatest weapon was not any particular tactic or technology, but their absolute refusal to accept defeat under any circumstances. When other species calculated odds and made rational decisions about when to retreat, humans simply fought harder and found new ways to hurt their enemies even when victory seemed impossible. The Coalition had been transformed by 2 years of human leadership from a desperate defensive alliance into a ruthless military machine that operated according to principles that most civilized species found disturbing. The gentle races that had once defined galactic culture were now conducting warfare with a brutality that would have been unimaginable before the humans arrived. The Draknari had abandoned their ancient codes of honor and started using human tactics like ambushes and sabotage and psychological warfare. The Luminari had learned to use their natural empathy as a weapon by understanding exactly what would cause their enemies the most fear and despair. The Cerebral Collective had turned their vast intelligence networks into instruments of deception and manipulation. Captain Siak Ho was commanding the attack on what intelligence reports identified as the Void Swarm's central command facility. The installation was hidden deep inside a heavily fortified star system that had been considered impossible to penetrate. But the humans had taught the Coalition that impossible was just another word for something that required more imagination and determination than usual. Instead of trying to fight their way through the system's defenses, Siak Ho's task force used a combination of stealth technology and misdirection to appear exactly where the enemy least expected them. They struck at the command center during a shift change when security was at its lowest and communication systems were temporarily offline for routine maintenance. The attack lasted less than an hour, but its effects rippled throughout Void Swarm territory as command and control networks collapsed and field commanders found themselves cut off from their superiors. Without centralized coordination, the Swarm's military machine began making mistakes and conflicting decisions that human-trained coalition forces were quick to exploit. Lieutenant Colonel Yoon Seo was leading a specialized unit that focused on what military theorists called strategic demoralization. Their job was not to destroy enemy forces, but to make them lose the will to continue fighting. They used propaganda, broadcasts and psychological operations and carefully planned demonstrations of power that were designed to break enemy morale rather than simply kill enemy soldiers. The Void Swarm was discovering something that humans had known for thousands of years. Physical defeat could be overcome with time and resources, but psychological defeat was much harder to recover from. When an army lost confidence in its leaders and its mission and its chances of survival, it became much easier to destroy even if it still had plenty of weapons and soldiers. Major Jiwoo was conducting what the humans called deep penetration raids using ships that had been specially modified for long-range operations behind enemy lines. Her mission was to strike at targets that the Void Swarm considered completely safe because they were so far from the front lines that no enemy force should have been able to reach them. The raids served multiple purposes beyond the immediate damage they caused. They demonstrated that nowhere in Swarm territory was truly secure, and that coalition forces could appear anywhere at any time. They forced the enemy to divert resources, from offensive operations to defensive measures protecting their rear areas. Most importantly, they showed that the humans were not content to simply defend coalition space, but were actively hunting the Void Swarm throughout the galaxy. The transformation of the war was complete. What had begun as a desperate last stand by a dying coalition had become a systematic campaign of destruction that was pushing the galaxy's most feared conquerors back into the darkness between stars. The Void Swarm was experiencing something they had never felt before, which was the knowledge that they were being hunted by predators more dangerous than themselves. For the first time in their long history of conquest, the Swarm was retreating, not because they had achieved their objectives, but because they could no longer maintain their positions against an enemy that refused to fight by civilized rules. Their orderly expansion had collapsed into chaotic retreat as human-trained coalition forces appeared everywhere at once, using tactics that violated every convention of warfare that had existed before the humans arrived. The galaxy watched in fascination and horror. Commander Na-un walked through the silent corridors of what had once been the Void Swarm's most powerful command ship. The massive vessel was now drifting powerless in the cold darkness of space, with its engines dead and its weapon systems destroyed, and its crew either killed or fled. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the walls that had once housed the minds that planned the conquest of the galaxy. The war was over. After 5 years of the most brutal fighting in galactic history, the Void Swarm had finally been defeated. Their fleets were scattered and broken, and their leadership was dead, or in hiding somewhere in the dark spaces between galaxies. The species that had once seemed unstoppable had chosen exile over continued conflict with the human-led coalition forces, but victory felt hollow and bitter, like medicine that cures the disease but leaves the patient forever changed. Na-un had been fighting for so long that she could barely remember what peace felt like. Her hands shook from too many battles and too many decisions that had cost lives, and too many nights spent wondering if the methods they were using were worth the results they achieved. The galaxy had been saved, but it was no longer the same place that the Void Swarm had threatened to destroy. The peaceful civilizations that had once defined galactic culture were gone, replaced by militaristic societies that had learned the human way of thinking about conflict and survival. Worlds that had known only harmony for thousands of years now maintained standing armies and weapons factories and training centers for soldiers. The beautiful Luminari, who had once created art and music that could make other species weep with joy, were now experts in guerrilla warfare and sabotage techniques. Their crystal cities had been rebuilt, but they were no longer places of pure beauty. Every structure was designed to serve as a fortress if enemies came again, and every citizen knew how to fight and kill and die for their people. The proud Draknari had abandoned their ancient codes of honor and adopted human military doctrines that emphasized winning over glory. Their warriors still trained constantly for battle, but they no longer charged straight at their enemies with weapons raised high and battle songs echoing across the field. Instead, they used ambushes and deception and whatever tactics would achieve victory with the least cost to their own forces. The wise cerebral collective had turned their vast intelligence networks into instruments of espionage and psychological warfare. Their libraries still contained all the knowledge of the galaxy, but much of their research now focused on better ways to break enemy morale and spread confusion and fear among potential threats to galactic security. Admiral Taman looked older than his years as he met with the human leadership for the final time before the coalition was formally disbanded. The elegant being who had once commanded fleets in desperate defensive battles was now scarred by years of conducting warfare according to principles that his species had never wanted to learn. The coalition was breaking apart as member species returned to their home territories to rebuild and recover from the long war. But none of them would ever be the same as they were before the humans arrived with their cold, practical approach to survival and victory. The galaxy had learned lessons that could not be unlearned and developed capabilities that could not be forgotten. General Kyung-ho had become the most famous and most feared military commander in galactic history. His training centers had produced a generation of soldiers who knew how to fight wars that previous generations could not have imagined. But now that the war was over, he wondered what would happen to all that knowledge and skill and carefully cultivated brutality. The humans faced their own difficult choices about what role they would play in the galaxy they had helped to save. Some coalition species wanted them as permanent military allies because they had proven their effectiveness against the greatest threat anyone had ever faced. Other species feared them as potential conquerors who might decide that the galaxy needed human leadership to prevent future disasters. Many alien races looked at humanity with a mixture of gratitude and terror, wondering what kind of beings could develop such efficient methods of causing death and destruction, and then use them so calmly and systematically. The humans had revealed themselves to be something that most species preferred not to think about, which was a race that had evolved specifically to be good at warfare. Captain Hyun-woo, who had started the whole transformation as a simple military advisor, now carried the weight of his species' reputation and the consequences of everything they had taught the galaxy. The humans had saved everyone, but they had also shown them a side of existence that many wished they could forget. But perhaps the most difficult question facing the post-war galaxy was what would happen to all the former coalition soldiers who had learned human methods of warfare and could not simply return to their old peaceful lives. They had been changed by their experiences in ways that went deeper than physical scars or traumatic memories. Lieutenant Sang-wook had been a communications officer on a Luminari exploration vessel before the war began. His job had been to make contact with new species and help establish diplomatic relations based on mutual understanding and respect. Now he was an expert in psychological operations who knew exactly how to break enemy morale and turn their own fears against them. The transition back to civilian life was proving impossible for many veterans who had spent years learning to think like predators and act without mercy when necessary. They had skills and knowledge that were essential during wartime but dangerous and unwelcome during peace. Society did not know what to do with them, and they did not know how to function in a world that no longer needed their particular talents. Commander, Shunsu had led special operations teams deep behind enemy lines using tactics that violated every rule of civilized warfare that had existed before the humans arrived. She had learned to kill without hesitation and to make decisions that cost lives without losing sleep at night. Now she was expected to return to a normal life, as if none of that had ever happened. The humans made a decision that surprised everyone in the galaxy, including themselves. Instead of expanding their influence or withdrawing into isolation, they chose a third option that reflected their understanding of what they had become and what the galaxy needed from them. They would serve as guardians watching the borders of known space for threats that might emerge from the darkness between stars. Human fleets would patrol the rim territories where new enemies might appear first. They would maintain the military academies and training centers, ensuring that the galaxy never again faced extinction, unprepared for war. But most importantly, they would serve as a reminder of what civilized species could become when survival was at stake. The peaceful races could return to their art and music and philosophy, knowing that somewhere in the darkness there were humans keeping watch and ready to teach the harsh lessons of warfare to anyone who threatened galactic civilization. Admiral Taemin spoke for many when he said that the galaxy had learned the price of survival and found it almost too expensive to pay. They had traded innocence for experience and peace of mind for the knowledge of what they were capable of when pushed to extremes. But they were alive, and that was worth something even if they were no longer sure what kind of beings they had become. The war was won, but peace would be forever different. The galaxy had discovered that sometimes the only way to preserve civilization was to become temporarily uncivilized, and that the guardians of light sometimes had to embrace darkness to keep the greater darkness at bay. And in the space between stars, other threats watched and waited, knowing that next time they would face not just any enemy, but the species that had turned warfare into an art form and survival into a science.